happy to be here at IIHS, and I'm very grateful to IIHS and Aroma for arranging this talk. It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Helmuth Berking. Professor Berking is an urban sociologist who teaches at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany and lives in Berlin, and has written many, many books, articles, papers, a lot of it in German, some of which have been translated into English. One of the books that is most well known and translated into English is called The Sociology of Giving. And along with a colleague, Martina Löw, Helmuth runs an institute for looking at cities, research on urban areas, particularly within the University of Darmstadt. And one of the things they've been working on a lot is this idea of the intrinsic logic of cities. I think he's going to talk about that more. His book, Sociology of Giving, was published by Sage in their Theory, Culture and Society series. And today he'll be talking about urbanity in Africa and looking specifically at the city of Mombasa. Please welcome Professor Berking.
So thank you very much for this kind invitation. Do I need it?
No, we can. I'm just going to clear that to make your life.
So thank you for having me, ladies and gentlemen. Since I'm neither an anthropologist nor an area specialist, let me start with some clarifications of what I'm trying to do. I speak here as a sociologist interested in the study of the city. The city constitutes a remarkable and highly contested topic. There is literally not a single human theme that is not and could not be imagined within the realm of the urban. Sex and crime, production and reproduction of power, hierarchy, poverty, lifestyle, and so forth. Paradigm shifts seem to be rampant, from structuralist to cultural turns, from political economy approaches to phenomenology. The main challenge, however, seems to go unanswered. It is sex in the city, poverty in the city, immigrants in the city, but what is meant by the city, other than an all-purpose nostrum for societal problems? I will briefly describe this point of confusion and take it as a point of departure to offer some conceptual ideas of how to constitute the city as an object of scientific knowledge. A frame of reference will be what is labeled the spatial turn in social sciences. And the main objectives are, first, to conceptualize the city as a particular space structuring form of association. Second, to identify and qualify some features of this spatial form. And third, to draw your attention to modes of perception, of perceiving the city as a meaningful whole. If we agree to the simple fact that not everywhere and anywhere is city, it should be feasible to grasp its distinctive spatial form as well as its internal structure as a symbolic order, as a world on its own. There's another problem that has to be mentioned briefly. The semantic overload of the term city in common parlance applies to two related topics in its tow line as well. Urbanity and urbanization seem to share this particular quality. The usual strategy to evoke meaning is to ascribe geographical denominations. The European city, African urbanity, and so forth, and by doing so to transform geographical signifiers into scientific typologies. But how do we know? How do we prove these propositions of an African city, for example, of African urbanities? which asserts that everything is different over there compared to. What concept of African urbanity, or you name it, Asian, European, South American urbanity counts for it? What idea of an African city as an object of knowledge is available, marking these differences to European or whatsoever cities? I will not delve into these muddy backwaters of urban discourse. Instead, I would rather like to discuss the possibilities as well as the restraints that show up if one applies this formal concept of the city as a spatial structure, not to an African city, but to a city in Africa. My point in case will be the port city of Mombasa. In this attempt of a highly tentative and provisional description, I take liberties. I use available information and quite limited personal experience, being aware of all these traps set for a Eurocentric, ignorant European researcher. The hope, nonetheless, is to start a dialogue on urbanization in Africa and in other parts of the world, probably, and most of all, to learn from your own research experiences. So let me start with the first part. Talking about the city, in what way whatsoever, implies necessarily an idea of what is meant by the city. But the term and its related vocabulary seems to operate like an empty signifier. It is the city differentiated from its urban problems compared to that evoke and stabilize whole world structures. If one locates the formative phase of, let's say, scientific city discourse at the beginning of the 20th century, there is little doubt that the big Euro-American city was perceived as a revolutionary new form of association. It may be sufficient to just mention Max Weber's typology of the Occidental city, the now famous work of Georg Simmel, or the observation of Robert Park, I quote, that it is because the city has a life quite its own that there is a limit to the arbitrary modifications which is possible to make, first in its physical structure and second in its moral order, end of quote. But the situation at that time seems to be quintessentially paradoxical. At that very moment, the big city takes center stage as a particular space of experience. Its representation as an object of scientific knowledge ends. It's the city that represents modern society without becoming a key term within the sciences of modern society. It's the city that provides the experience for social theorizing without getting theorized in her part. In short, it's a city that did not make it as a key concept of social sciences. Discourse formation followed another path. The city got subsumed under and invalidated by society as the major frame of reference. The study of the city then was, and still continues to be, the study of the representation of modern society. Two interesting observations shall be mentioned. First, it has never been the city rather than very particular cities that shaped urban theorizing. Chicago has been the showcase for urban research until the early 1960s. 19th century Paris served as a metonymy for urbanity and modernity. New York City is the model for global and world city approaches, and LA gets conceptualized usually as the archetypical representation of a postmodern city. It does not come as a surprise that no name of a city in Africa appears in this line. If all that counts is the condition of modern society, Africa fails. But that particular space at the end of the line does not remain empty. No names, no particular places. But again, the forceful metonymy covers this blank. In strict analogy to the rhetoric of failing states, African urbanity stands for failing cities. Second, if one takes a closer look at the quotidian state of the art of urban studies, you would find two types of theorizing. On the one hand, there is the tradition beginning with the Chicago School to conceptualize the city as a laboratory for societal problems of all kinds. The city then is just this, an address where the phenomena of society and its crisis, capitalism, modernization, underdevelopment of globalization, migration, poverty, and so on, are played out. On the other hand, one finds a broad field of urban research dedicated to particular topics and practices within the city. Analytical attention focuses on the specialization of urban specificities, migrant neighborhoods, poverty, lifestyle, and so forth. Anthropologists, to quote Henk Driesen, and I'm no exception, have a special vocation for studying marginal phenomena. This holds certainly true for urban anthropology, much of which consists of studies on ethnic, predominantly marginal microcosms and subcultures in metropolitan societies. Or, as Clifford Geertz once stated, I quote, "Anthropologists don't study villages, tribes, towns, cities. They study in villages." In both cases, in urban sociology as well as in urban anthropology, the surprising result is that the empirical unit, usually labeled as city, is of no particular interest. Even more, the city as an object of knowledge literally gets negated. The center of urban research remains empty. In the light of these disturbing subtotal, the conceptual idea I want to put forward is easy to grasp. It admits to the claim Swedish anthropologist Ulf Hannerz made already decades ago, to transform the usual anthropology sociology in the city into an anthropology sociology of the city. Do not exclusively study in cities, but study the cities themselves. Take the concrete city, the whole of this city as frame for empirical research. This change of perspective from general societal problems to be studied in the city to the city as an empirical given is not at all trivial. It substitutes the quite common and epistemologically weak concept of the city as just a space where societal problems occur for the challenge to take the whole of the city into account, to unveil its distinctive, its individual Gestalt, which is Gestalt, it's the same, it's a German word anyway. Poverty, for example, as well as power or exploitation, order or social reproduction, play their role in cities. But it's very easy and very simple. They are not exclusively urban problems. The urban form in general, and this city in particular, obviously add specific meaning to them. And it is exactly this transformation that counts. Not to, for example, research inequality ratios in Cape Town compared to, but Cape Townian inequality in its everyday practices, its organizational and institutional setting that has to be understood. Not to research immigrant communities in Mombasa, but to come up with the Mombasa mode of negotiating immigration. So, just to climb a tiny little bit further into the air of abstraction, let me briefly describe this kind of conceptualization of a city I have in mind. The city as an object of scientific knowledge, so the thesis goes, can be conceptualized as a particular form of association, or more precisely, as a space structuring form of organizing size, density, and heterogeneity. Again, what counts is the spatial form of organizing and shaping processes of densification and heterogenization. These spatial form evokes, metaphorically speaking, a particular heat, a temperature that forces all kinds of environments to react to each other, and by doing so, we will not only unseen, unexpected combination, but also to a framework where the built environment, material structures, and cultural dispositions inextricably intertwine. Deconstructing and organizing of a spatial unit by densification and heterogenization are the main properties of what may be labeled the city. So you don't usually, now I'm sorry that I'm relying on mostly European examples, you usually don't find a bishop in the countryside, but not every city is blessed with such an institution. A single homosexual does not make up for a clubbing scene. Or you would rarely find a cluster of corporate headquarters in a village. But again, not every city is New York City. So understanding the city as this kind of spatial form of organizing phenomena via densification has a certain impact on what is meant by using the semantics of the city. In this reading, it is not communication, it is not interaction, lifestyle, or milieu. It's not neighborhood, central business district, or whatsoever. All these content-related appreciations cannot constitute a proper object, because theoretically, they got attributed much too early. So thinking the city as a particular space structuring form that is characterized by two, and only two, qualitative features, density and heterogeneity, you can see that pretty simple offers the advantage to desist from all controversial definitions with regard to content. Questions about what becomes densified, how and under which circumstances these processes are played out are those infamous empirical questions. Therefore, analytical attention is directed to discover the particular, the local mode of production of distinctiveness. What we qualify the intrinsic logic of cities then is pretty easy to grasp. This intrinsic logic refers to the specific. For this city, typical mode and content of densification, which evokes a sense of place where, again, the built environment, material structures, and cultural dispositions not only intertwine, but also give a certain aspect of meaning to everyday life and social practices. So theorizing the city is always a nice and tempting intellectual exercise. Empirical research, however, is quite a different matter. Since I have not really in-depth research done in Africa, this would be time to finish my talk. Anyway, I will take the risk. The aim here is, even in conceptual terms, limited. What follows is a provisional attempt to provide some clues for what could be meant by the proposition to put the city itself, the whole of the city, at center stage. This whole of a city is not accessible to individual experience. Nevertheless, it's there affecting and shaping perception and experience. Its internal structure seems to be metonymic, past pro-toto representations of all kinds, from visual images to corporeal attitudes, from grand narratives to local music. One of the most important representation of the whole is pretty simple. I mean, it's just the name of the city, and especially the stories that have been told and can be told in this name. For analytical reasons, I will distinguish two modes of narration. One narrative from the outside in, and the other from the inside out. So, what has been and can be told in the name of Mombasa? Mombasa is the second largest city in Kenya and in East Africa, the most important seaport in the region, and one of the oldest urban centers on the continent with a population of approximately 1 million. Its pre-colonial name, Mvita, Island of War, refers not only to a turbulent past but to a geographical location. Mombasa is an island separated by 2 creeks from the coast. 2 natural gifts determine the history of the place, a natural harbor and the monsoon. Also still small in size, it has been a world city for quite a while because of its extraordinary geographical range. For more than a millennium, the port city has played its particular part in the dense network of the Indian Ocean trade stretching from the East African coast to Indonesia and further. The city in the path of the monsoon is a geocultural event composed of multiple syncretism. Via Islam, it is strongly tied into the Arabic Peninsula. Economic, financial, and cultural impacts from South Asia are as important as common. There is a Mombasa that got connected to the 2 Americas in the west and to Macau in the east by the Portuguese, and finally became part of the British Empire, which left strong cultural footprints in the educational and juridical system of the now independent nation state. And it is exactly this kind of geopolitical position as a crossroad of multiple cultural flows that explains why within a day, children in quotidian Mombasa cross to symbolic universes different times, speaking Kiswahili at home, listening to Arabic in the mosque, watching Indian movies, and learning obligatory English at school. Multiculturalization, if you want to say so, in capital letters, is written on the birth certificate of Mvita, Mombasa. While, for example, European cities experience this phenomenon as an effect of decolonization counting in decades, this very particular syncretism in Mombasa has been an everyday practice for centuries. Ali Mazrui, a political scientist at Columbia University, but also a descendant of the Mazrui family, which ruled Mombasa as an independent city-state for more than a century, and which still is a major address of the local elite, narrates the story of Mombasa exactly in this mode of its ever-changing geopolitical positioning in the world. Let me briefly recount some lines of this narrative. Mazrui differentiates 3 stages: an Afro-Oriental, an Afro-Occidental, and an Afro-Global phase. The Afro-Oriental phase is a period when traditions from West and South Asia interacted with African traditions, forming Mvita. The place itself was in reach of the trading ships from all parts of Asia and started a nautical and shipbuilding tradition of its own. Its proximity to the Arabian Peninsula made Mvita to one of the entry ports of Islam into Eastern Africa. Porcelain, silk, and finery came in and was usually paid for in ivory, copra, and skins. Slave trade on a limited scale seemed already to be the case. The local cuisine turned into a mixture of Indian, Arab, and African food cultures. Rice became the staple diet, new spices were introduced, keeping their Arab names, while certain elaborated dishes stick to their Indian names until now. The musical culture of Mvita Mombasa integrated the small Indian drum as well as the Arab oud, a common string instrument. The most profound change, however, that came from Asia into Mombasa relates to religion and language. Islam enters Eastern Africa during the lifetime of Muhammad. Persecuted Muslims find asylum first in Abyssinia, then in Mombasa. Shortly after the death of the Prophet, mosques were erected in the region long before they started to shape the skyline of the Middle East. Islam in Mombasa is older than Islam in Istanbul, in Islamabad, and whole Pakistan. It may even be older than in parts of the Arab world itself. Islamic rules of marriage, kinship, inheritance, and succession, first in hard competition with indigenous norms, finally got the upper hand. The rest cultures changed dramatically. The concept of nakedness was totally abandoned. The kansu for men and the bui bui for women entered the picture. Architecture took its particular form initially with the minaret and the mosque, but also in the built environment of the ordinary home, designed now by the Islamic conception of gender and segregation. Here you see a little bit, I mean, these were the place where the women would do their grocery shopping by leaving down some baskets. When Vasco da Gama disembarked on April 1498, the Afro-Occidental phase of the city begins. Da Gama experiences a prosperous urban environment with about 10,000 inhabitants, similar to a type of independent city-states like in Italy or the Hanse in the Baltic. Mombasians, because of their nautical experience, helped those adventurers to finally find their way to India and received their thank you some years later when the Portuguese returned with warships starting to colonize the East African coast. They built Fort Jesus, until today one of the signature buildings of Mombasa, left their marks on warfare by introducing guns and cannons, and on the food culture by introducing potatoes and maize. Except for these and some Swahili words of Portuguese origin, the cultural impact did not endure. But interestingly enough, now there appears a gap in the narrative of the colonial past. The Omani rulers, including the Mazrui family, were and are still, for cultural and religious reasons, not perceived as colonizers. They made Zanzibar the epicenter of the eastern coast, and now slave trade became a major business. Of course, in terms of westernizing Mombasa, it was clearly the period under British rule that made its impact. The new colonizers who made Mombasa the capital of the East African Protectorate until 1907 were forced to go home in December 1963. In the meantime, colonial policy took its path by implementing primary and secondary schools, establishing a legal system and an elaborate mode of accountability, integrating the whole region into the global British Empire. The English language was implanted as well as a British-style education based on the standards set by the University of Cambridge. School teachers and, of course, missionaries from England made their inroad into town. Westernization, to a certain extent, trickled down to the deepest pores of everyday life in the city. At the first half of the 20th century, newspapers began to appear, of which the Mombasa Times, daily published in English and run by Europeans, was the most influential. Journals and publications in Swahili, Arabic, and in different Indian languages, from South Asia, followed to suit. The face of the city and its external composition changed dramatically. Old Town became surrounded by colonial architecture, administrative building, an Anglican cathedral, and not to be forgotten, the central railway station as the point of departure for the famous Uganda Railway, which in today's Mombasa is an impressive oasis of astonishing quiet. Economic activity finally shifted to Kilindini Harbour and left the old port for coastal traffic. Under British rule, the territory was not only good for maximum extraction, Kenya became a white settler colony too. Due to this politics of white immigration aiming at the so-called white hinterlands, Mombasa was bypassed by a minor train stop that turns into a vibrant metropolis within only decades and became the capital of Kenya. What saved Mombasa from insignificance and still will do for the rest of at least the coming century, again, was and still is its strategic position as a port city. During the post-colonial period, not only the epicenter of westernization in Mombasa shifted from Great Britain to the United States, influencing, of course, local cuisine, dress codes, and popular culture. It was also nation-state formation that evoked quite new and disturbing frames of reference. The Afro-Occidental phase left its imprint in religious terms. Within the horizon of the national society, tied in to a certain extent to Christianity, Mombasa is perceived as a Muslim city, a religious as well as culturally defined outsider. Seen from Mombasa, those upcountry people present both infidels and uncivilized ethnics, as well as new colonizers taking advantage of their power and seeking to enhance quite illegitimate opportunity structures within a city that does not belong to them. There is another bifurcation between city and state. During the Cold War, Kenya became the darling of the West, while Mombasa was still a main port within the geography of the Indian Ocean. Therefore, Islam in Mombasa became indeed politically more radical in the 1990s, changing the atmosphere of the city noticeably. Tourist flows until now usually bypass the city and concentrate solely on the outer beaches. Today, Mombasa certainly is one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Africa, whose architecture, population, and cultural dispositions represent at least a millennium of urbanization as a form of life. Of course, there is endless more to be told with reference to the name of the city. I will briefly add one major topic to these glimpses of a narrative from the outside in. Mombasa is not only an integrated part in the Indian Ocean trade network, but also part of what can be labeled a culturally distinctive regional group referred to by anthropologists as Swahili Society, stretching from Mogadishu to Zanzibar and further south. Swahili Society is a not territorialized entity of local communities constituting the first and only urban civilization at the East African coast. Their basic social unit is and has been the town. Their defining features are religion, meaning Islam, and second, their particular role within the Indian Ocean trade as a so-called middleman society. Also African by origin, social reproduction excludes those from the hinterlands who were used, abused, and sold as slaves. Otherwise, intermarriage rules remain fuzzy, mostly driven by faith and opportunity structures, and favorably incorporating people from the Arab Peninsula. The Anglophone world, meaning the British world at the end of the 19th century and still in love with heavy racialized categories, invented for this new breed the term mongrel Arabs. The heyday of Swahili society exceeded when slavery was banned, but Swahili, meaning the people of the coast, is still the common language of this coast, and what is quite more interesting, its system of cultural classifications seems to remain in place. Mombasa is, whatever else might also be the case, not only an Islamic, but also a Swahili city. So where does this from the outside in leaves us? It's certainly not the story of Mombasa, rather than the story of Mombasa's changing position in the world. And it's certainly not accessible to participant observation, but it may provide important insights for identifying those splinters from elsewhere that show up in local contexts. Its major flaw relates to the city itself. Mombasa remains at the receiving end, a passive entity where everything that is of importance inside finds, which is the usual case, its causes somewhere else. Its major advantage, however, is this point in case. Whatever else, the local construction of locality, which is really the challenge here, the local construction of locality can never ever be unlocked on the socio-spatial scale of the local itself. Or, to make a long story short, Mombasa is neither Oman nor India, but without Oman and India, Mombasa is not Mombasa. The alternate mode of narration would feature the city as its main character. The story is hard to come up with, at least for me by now. So let me finish with some observations and questions. A city that deeply entrenched in history does not live off of its surface. In fact, it is a kind of cumulative, I never can say this word, cumulative, the cumulative structure or texture of the city, which layer by layer builds up on an ever-changing web of meaning and practices. Its time and its spatial densification, economically related to the port, nautical and trading occupational structures, politically to local autonomy and total dependency, culturally to a mercantile and religiously to an Islamic city, shot through on all levels with processes of heterogenization. Mombasa does not simply incorporate what comes in. It is not reception, rather than reinvention and translation, taking possession to make it fit. The proximity of the central mosque, the Anglican cathedral, and a huge Shiva temple, you can see only part of it because I'm not a professional photographer, may offer a visual image of the very particular configuration that has to be in place to make this happen. So, I mentioned before it's a port city. As a port city, Mombasa and every other port city is in need of a particular infrastructure tied to storage, transportation, and logistics. But the port itself functions also as a sluice in the slope of complexity. The overall term of a middleman society meets exactly this type. Mombasa is not only this sluice in the slope of complexity, but also a city of middlemen organizing extraction from the hinterland, but never getting involved in any affairs of the hinterland. This border, as a cultural line of divide between civilized and wild, between dressed and nakedness, between we and them, is still in operation today. A Swahili scholar and a fifth-generation Indian merchant would just use these attributions to constructing their common imagined we. Those who perceive themselves as the real owners of the city, the Swahili, down to 60,000 in Mombasa today, are culturally still in command to define inside and outside. So let me just come with another tiny little story that really shed some light on what is going on in terms of recent and quotidian political struggle and so on. Pwani se Kenya. The coast is not Kenya. In 2005, the Republican Council, a new organization, enters the political arena by addressing a letter, now listen, a letter to Queen Elizabeth, stating the many grievances of coastal people, poor educational provision, domination of the upcountry people, land robbery, and concluding, I quote, "We, the coastal protectorate natives, denounce the citizenship of Kenya. The coastal protectorate, known as Mombasa, is declared the Republic of Mombasa from now and is under the authority of the Republican Council. End of quote. These secessionist voices and its political organization, the Mombasa Republican Council, still power but not really successful until today, do not only threaten the Kenyan state, they also, and this is probably much more important, they also articulate a bundle of major motives that shape perception and action orientation in everyday life, offering an everlasting frame for us and them, for othering, for alterity and identity. This language of secessionism is historical, drawing on and mobilizing collective memory. Its topic is the history of the famous 10-mile strip of the Kenyan coast, formerly the territory of the Sultan of Zanzibar, and related to multiple treaties between this Sultan and the British from 1895, starting the British and independent Kenya in the 60s. Treaties which all dealt with the more or less juridically secured autochthony of the coast. Also, there are quite some headstrong interpretations by the Mombasa Republican Council. This bottom line remains. This is the point. It's race and it's land. Who are the rightful owners of the coast in general and of Mombasa in particular? If the upcountry people are collectively categorized as land grabbers who systematically deprive the rightful owners of all their revenues, the fight is on and still going on. And since interests are at least as important as ideas, this configuration will have certainly its impact. Its impact on future prospects of both the coastal and the upcountry people, who still perceive and categorize each other in ethnic terms. The latter are reminded 6 times a day by the Muslim soundscape of the city that they don't belong. One finds different time regimes within Mombasa, and the mostly upcountry dominated police prefers to stay away from Old Town. These different presence in the presence, so to speak, provide a very uncertain roadmap for the future. A final disturbing observation has to do with the idea of, I was so proud to tell you, of doing research and finding out representations of the city as a whole. I have to tell you, representations of Mombasa were hard to come up with. On a visual level, even postcards did not fit the bill. Asking about the city would not really generate answers. For example, Mombasa is like Hamburg. The difference is what happens in the house. Or, Mombasa is similar to Hyderabad. I don't feel out of place neither here nor there. And so on and so forth. And then if you would ask people to locate themselves in the city, they would always say, well, it's Old Town. Then you had a hard time to come up, well, I mean, they can't, not all of them can live and stay in Old Town. And finally, this whole story was just generated through genealogy. So that was their place of origin, and it's still the main address for group-related talks and identities. Now, and then I will finish immediately because I took too much time. Now you have a quite complicated situation because since the 1990s, there's an ongoing flow of Somali refugees coming in. And these Somali refugees have 2 advantages. First, they speak the language. So some of them at least speak Swahili because it's part of that. Second, they are not, some of them again, are not really poor. So they are buying up Old Town. Now nowadays you have a Somali population within Old Town, which is, let's say, the holy place of the Mombasa Swahili Society, running to up to 60%. Given this secessionism, I wonder what kind of coalition building is possible in terms of these two groups sharing the same faith, sharing partly the same languages, but again are totally against each other in terms of, let's say, land ownership and so on and so forth. So I will finish here. Just thank you for your attention.